There is a moment in air combat when confidence becomes fatal. It does not announce itself with music or warning. It arrives in a flash of reflected sunlight on aluminum, in the sudden collapse of a formation, in the shock of seeing an enemy aircraft do something it was never supposed to do. Over Europe, for more than a few German pilots, that moment came when they met the Lockheed P-38 Lightning and realized too late that the aircraft they had dismissed as awkward, oversized, and vulnerable could kill them with brutal efficiency. At first glance, the P-38 looked wrong for a fighter war over Europe. It was too long, too strange, too heavy-looking. Its twin booms gave it an almost unfinished appearance, as if it belonged to some experimental hangar rather than the hard sky above France, Belgium, or Western Germany. To men raised in a fighter culture that prized compact, sharp, elegant machines, the Lightning seemed ungainly. German pilots who trusted the sleek lines of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the predatory confidence of the Focke-Wulf 190 often saw the P-38 and thought not of danger, but of compromise. A twin-engine fighter, to them, was a machine that had already admitted weakness. Too much aircraft, too much drag, too much complexity, too much target. And yet the war had a way of punishing men who judged too quickly from a silhouette. Imagine the sky over occupied Europe in the cold light of morning. High altitude, thin air, engines strained to a metallic edge. Below, the land lies in fractured tones, fields cut by hedgerows, roads glistening faintly, smoke rising from rail junctions that American bombers had come to destroy. The Luftwaffe climbs to intercept. German pilots are tired, but many are still dangerous. Some are veterans of years of combat. They have survived Britain, Russia, North Africa. They have watched enemies burn and disappear into cloud. They trust experience. They trust instinct. And instinct tells them that the real threat is the bomber stream, maybe the escorting single-engine fighters, but not this odd twin-boomed American machine. Then the fight begins, and what they believe starts to fall apart. The P-38 does not enter combat like a clumsy outsider. It comes in with speed, often from altitude, often as part of a disciplined formation that has learned the value of patience. Its concentrated nose armament means there is no need to harmonize converging wing guns. When it fires, the burst is tight, savage, and direct. A German pilot who misjudges the closure rate, who pulls a little too hard, who assumes the Lightning cannot follow or recover, suddenly finds cannon shells and machine gun rounds tearing through cockpit glass, wings, engine cowling. There is no time for theory then, no time for jokes. Only the hard, immediate terror of a machine that refuses to behave according to the myth built around it. That is where this story begins, not in the factory, not in the brochure, not in the proud claims of engineers or propagandists, but in the instant when laughter stops in the middle of a dogfight. For German pilots, mockery of the P-38 did not come from nothing. It came from habit, from partial truth, and from a culture of fighter superiority that had once been earned the hard way. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had often held the edge in tactics, experience, and confidence. Men who had grown used to defeating opponents over Poland, France, the Balkans, and deep over Soviet territory developed a particular way of looking at enemy aircraft. They read airframes almost like body language, the way a nose sat, the shape of the wing, the proportion of engine to fuselage. The elegance of a fighter mattered, because elegance suggested harmony between man and machine. The P-38 did not look elegant. It looked industrial, American, heavy with intention. German eyes, trained by years of combat and by a certain disdain for Allied design philosophy, often misread that entirely. But the Lightning had been built for a very different kind of war. It had range. It had endurance. It had firepower arranged with clinical American logic. It had two engines where a single hit might destroy another fighter. It had a cockpit suspended between twin tails like a command pod, giving its pilot not just control, but a strange sense of presence in the sky. And when flown with discipline, especially in fast slashing combat rather than theatrical turning duels, it could be far deadlier than its awkward appearance suggested. This mattered because war in the skies over Europe was no longer a matter of isolated duels between brilliant men. It was becoming a contest of systems, a contest of reach. A contest of whether bombers could go deep into occupied territory and return. The Germans, many of them, still looked at the fight through the older lens of the expert hunter. The Americans were beginning to fight it as something larger, a rolling industrial campaign carried out through formations, escort doctrine, fuel, production, replacement pilots, coordination, and pressure applied day after day after day. The P-38 was not merely a fighter in that struggle. It was an argument in aluminum. It said that a machine did not need to conform to old expectations to become deadly. It said that range could matter as much as grace. It said that survivability and concentration of fire could rewrite the rules of an engagement before pride had time to adjust. And so, over Europe, in the roar and glare of aerial war, German pilots began to encounter something more dangerous than a new aircraft. They began to encounter a misjudgment they had already carried into battle. If you had been there, inside one of those cockpits, strapped into a seat slick with sweat under heavy flight gear, oxygen mask tight against your face, scanning a sky full of sunlight and threat, the realization would have come in fragments. First surprise, then confusion, then anger, then fear. The P-38 was not supposed to survive that dive, not supposed to accelerate that quickly, not supposed to hold together under pressure, not supposed to fire with such concentrated violence. And yet there it was, twin tails flashing past, engines thundering, leaving a seasoned German pilot with seconds to understand that he had entered the fight believing the wrong thing. That is the essence of the Warfront Archive story, what they believed, what really happened. And once we step back from the first violent shock of combat, a harder question waits for us. Why were so many German pilots so certain that the P-38 was nothing special to begin with? To understand why German pilots mocked the P-38, you have to enter the mental world of the Luftwaffe at a time when belief could still feel like inheritance. By the time American fighter formations were pushing deeper into European skies, Germany's fighter arm was no longer the fresh, unstoppable instrument of early war. It had been bloodied, stretched, and worn down. But culture outlives strength. Even as the Luftwaffe was beginning to face the suffocating pressure of Allied production and expanding air power, many of its pilots still carried the old instinctive confidence of an elite force. This confidence had roots. It had been built in victory, refined in experience, and hardened by the professional pride of men who truly did know how to fight. A veteran Luftwaffe pilot was not simply someone who could fly well. He had survived a merciless environment where small mistakes became funerals. He had learned to judge altitude, closure rate, energy, and danger almost without conscious thought. He trusted the aircraft he knew. He trusted his own eye. He trusted the traditions of his fighter arm. And in that world, the ideal fighter was something like a blade. Compact, responsive, sharp, immediate. The P-38 was none of those things at first glance. Seen from a distance, it looked like a contradiction. Twin engines, twin booms, a central cockpit nacelle, large wings, long profile. It carried none of the visual economy of the Bf-109. It did not project the coiled aggression of the FW-190. To German eyes shaped by years of combat and by a preference for aircraft that seemed to wrap tightly around the pilot, the Lightning looked almost excessive. It was as though American engineers, given the task of building a fighter, had responded by building half a heavy aircraft and hoping speed would excuse the rest. That perception mattered more than it should have. In war, reputation can enter the cockpit before the enemy does. Pilots talk, ground crews talk. Intelligence officers produce impressions that get filtered through prior bias. A strange aircraft gains a story long before most men ever face it in combat. Some German pilots believed the P-38 was too heavy to mix aggressively. Others assumed twin engines meant vulnerability through complexity. There was also a broader cultural assumption at work, that American military design often favored size and mechanical force over finesse. To a Luftwaffe veteran raised on maneuver doctrine and sharp tactical instinct, that could look like crude strength rather than refined threat. And to be fair, parts of this judgment were not entirely imaginary. The P-38 did have real problems, especially in the European theater. At high speed in a dive, compressibility could become dangerous and even deadly. Pilots reported control difficulties that made certain maneuvers terrifying. The cockpit could be cold at altitude, punishingly so. Maintenance could be demanding. The aircraft demanded skill and discipline. It was not a forgiving toy. It was a serious machine, and serious machines expose their weaknesses whenever conditions turn ugly enough. German pilots who noticed some of those flaws were not fools. The problem was not that they saw weakness. The problem was that they mistook weakness for uselessness. That mistake becomes easier to understand when you remember the broader condition of the air war in Europe before American escort tactics reached full maturity. In those earlier encounters, the U.S. Army Air Forces were still learning painful lessons. Bomber formations paid dearly for going in too deep without adequate cover. Escort ranges were limited. Coordination was evolving. American pilots, many brave but still inexperienced compared with hardened German veterans, were entering one of the most lethal combat environments in the world. In such an environment, early impressions matter. A German pilot who saw an American formation struggle, or who saw a P-38 flown timidly, could easily file the aircraft into the category of overbuilt Allied machinery not elegant enough, not dangerous enough, not worth fearing. This is how wartime myths survive. They feed on fragments. The Luftwaffe, moreover, had another reason to underestimate the Americans. It had long relied on the idea that combat excellence lived in men more than in machines. That belief was not entirely false. Pilot quality mattered enormously. Tactical skill mattered. Reaction time, confidence, aggression, formation, discipline, all of it mattered. But that same belief could become a trap when the enemy was not trying to beat you by the old terms alone. The Americans were not only building pilots, they were building an air system. Factories, fuel, spare parts, escort doctrine, replacement training, formation procedures, navigation, radio coordination, strategic objectives piece by piece. They were constructing a style of air war that did not need to flatter German standards in order to defeat them. From the German point of view, this was difficult to absorb quickly because it violated something deeper than tactical expectation. It violated taste. The Luftwaffe's fighter culture admired aircraft that felt personal, immediate, almost intimate in their connection between man and machine. The P-38 felt distant by comparison, industrial, deliberate. It seemed to belong not to the romantic mythology of the ace, but to a colder, larger war. And yet, that was exactly why it mattered. The Lightning had been designed not just to duel, but to reach. Range was its own kind of power. Over Europe, where the bomber offensive increasingly demanded escort farther and farther into contested space, that power could become decisive. An aircraft German pilots laughed at because it looked ungainly might still arrive where it needed to be, still fire hard enough to kill, still survive damage, still escort bombers longer than expected, still turn one more interception into one more exhausted German landing, or one more empty German bunk in a fighter barracks. What German pilots thought they were facing then was not pure fantasy. They believed they were facing an aircraft with real flaws, flown by an enemy still learning the game, backed by a culture that favored quantity over elegance. Those were not invented observations, but they were incomplete. And incompleteness in war is often more dangerous than simple ignorance, because when you think you already understand the enemy, you stop asking the questions that might save your life. If you listen closely to the mood of the wartime sky, that is the tension building underneath this entire story. Mockery can be a form of denial. Not always, but often. It lets men hold on to the familiar shape of the war, even when the war itself is changing. And by the time the first quiet signs appear that the old judgment is failing, pride can make revision feel like weakness. The P-38 was about to force exactly that revision. Because what the Germans were judging, in many cases, was the shape of the aircraft. What they had not yet fully grasped was the kind of threat it represented once American tactics, purpose, and persistence began to align around it. They were reading the outline, not the danger inside it. And that is where the first great miscalculation begins. The most dangerous battlefield mistakes are often not the loudest ones. They are not always reckless charges or catastrophic orders barked across a map table. Sometimes they begin with a glance, a quick reading, a professional judgment made too smoothly because it fits too neatly into what a man already believes. That was the heart of the Luftwaffe's miscalculation with the P-38. They judged the shape, and in doing so, they missed the threat. From the outside, the Lightning seemed to advertise its limitations. It was large for a fighter. Larger meant easier to hit. Twin engines meant more machinery to fail, more weight to carry, more drag to overcome. Its silhouette lacked the compact aggression German pilots associated with superiority in a dogfight. In a war where many combat decisions were made in seconds, appearances could influence instinct, and instinct could influence survival. If a German pilot saw the Lightning as a machine best avoided only when circumstances favored it, rather than as a serious opponent to be respected from the start, he might enter the engagement with the wrong assumptions already lodged in his mind. But aircraft are not simply shapes in the sky. They are bundles of capabilities, limits, and design choices, and the P-38's design reflected a different answer to the problem of air war. It had range, and range was not glamorous until suddenly it was. In the European air war, especially as American bombing doctrine pushed farther into Nazi-occupied territory and eventually toward the heart of Germany itself, range was the difference between temporary pressure and persistent pressure. A fighter that could go deeper meant bombers protected longer. Protected bombers meant more strikes delivered, more industrial targets threatened, more rail lines broken, more fuel facilities smashed, more pressure forced onto an already strained German defense system. To a pilot focused on the immediate duel, range might seem abstract. To a command structure trying to break an enemy nation from the air, it was everything. The P-38 also carried its firepower in a way that could be devastating in the brief, violent geometry of aerial combat. With armament concentrated in the nose, it did not have the spread pattern of wing-mounted guns converging at a chosen distance. When a Lightning pilot placed his aircraft properly, the result could be brutally efficient. A burst could arrive like a hammer stroke rather than a scatter. German pilots who assumed the large American fighter would be slower to bring killing force onto target sometimes discovered the opposite in the worst possible way. Then there was survivability. Twin engines gave the P-38 a kind of stubborn resilience that single-engine fighters could not always match. Damage that might doom another aircraft did not always end a Lightning. That mattered not just for tactical reasons, but for morale and pilot confidence. An aircraft that can bring a damaged pilot home is not merely a machine, it becomes a companion, a grim reassurance on the longest missions over hostile ground. American pilots who trusted that quality could fight with a certain kind of hard composure. German pilots who expected a quick kill might instead find a wounded enemy still climbing, still maneuvering, still firing back. All of this points to a deeper truth. The P-38 was not built to flatter the Luftwaffe's preferred style of combat. It was not trying to be a better Messerschmitt. It was part of an American answer to a different strategic question. How do you project fighter power across vast distances, preserve escort integrity, deliver concentrated violence, and support a campaign rather than merely win a duel? That distinction matters because the Germans, especially experienced fighter pilots, often saw the sky through the lens of the duel. This was natural. They lived and died in immediate engagements. They measured danger through maneuver, timing, and skill. But the Americans, increasingly, were fighting the air war as an integrated system. Bombers, escorts, routes, target priorities, altitude plans, fuel calculations, formation discipline, replacement pipelines, these were not background details, they were part of the weapon. The Lightning fit inside that system better than its critics wanted to admit. And yet this was not a story of an invincible aircraft humiliating fools. That would be too simple, too clean, and less true. The P-38's flaws were real. In Europe, those flaws could be brutal. Compressibility in dives terrified pilots and killed some of them. The aircraft's controls could become treacherous under certain conditions. High-altitude operations in the bitter cold punished both man and machine. Maintenance crews faced a serious workload. Flying the Lightning well required training, composure, and an understanding of what it should and should not do in combat. German criticism of the aircraft therefore had substance. The mistake lay not in noticing those weaknesses, but in assuming they erased the Lightning's advantages. War rarely works that way. A flawed weapon in a system that uses it intelligently can be far deadlier than a perfect weapon placed in the wrong tactical or strategic framework. This is where battlefield reality began exposing German misjudgment. The P-38 was most dangerous not when forced into the romantic ideal of a twisting close-in duel, but when used according to its strengths, speed, coordinated attacks, firepower, range, and disciplined engagement. American pilots and commanders, often through painful experience, began to learn that they did not need the Lightning to excel at every form of combat. They needed it to perform decisively at the right moments. They needed it to be where the bombers were vulnerable. They needed it to slash rather than linger. They needed it to punish overconfidence. That last point mattered enormously because overconfidence in air combat is not merely emotional, it becomes tactical. A German pilot who underestimates a P-38 may press an attack at the wrong angle, stay too long in a firing lane, assume an escape window exists when it does not, or commit to a maneuver that exposes him to the Lightning's concentrated nose guns. In aerial warfare, fractions of a second separate judgment from death. A bad assumption can become wreckage before the pilot has time to recognize it as one. There is also a psychological dimension here that becomes clearer the deeper the war goes. The Luftwaffe's early excellence created a dangerous inheritance. Many German pilots had learned, through bitter but real success, that confidence could carry them. Against less experienced opponents, against fragmented coordination, against enemies who had not yet adapted, that belief often proved justified. But against a growing American air arm that was willing to absorb losses, revise tactics, and keep coming back with industrial consistency, the old confidence began to age badly. The P-38 became one of the aircraft through which that aging was made visible. If you picture the war from high above, it starts to look less like a series of elegant individual combats and more like a pressure system closing in. Long-range escorts deny easy access to bombers. German defenders are forced into more dangerous interceptions. Veteran pilots accumulate fatigue. Newer replacements arrive without equivalent experience. The margin for error narrows. An aircraft once mocked for its ungainly shape becomes part of the mechanism strangling the Luftwaffe's freedom of action. So when we say German pilots judged the shape, not the threat, we are saying something larger than a technical correction. We are saying they read the aircraft as an object instead of as a role inside a changing war. They saw size and complexity. They did not yet fully see purpose, persistence, doctrine, and adaptation. But reputations do not collapse in one dramatic instant. They erode, quietly, through repeated encounters, through after-action reports, through conversations on airfields, through the slow, unwelcome spread of respect among men who once laughed. And that brings us to the turning point almost nobody recognized at first, the moment when the P-38 stopped being a curiosity and started becoming a lesson. Not every turning point looks like history while it is happening. That is one of war's cruel habits. The truly decisive shifts often arrive without fanfare, hidden inside repetition. A new escort pattern, a more disciplined attack profile, a squadron that no longer wastes itself chasing the wrong fight. A commander who finally understands what an aircraft is for, not just what it can do. By the time men realize the meaning of those changes, the consequences are already unfolding. The P-38's rise in the skies over Europe was like that. There was no single morning when every Luftwaffe pilot woke up and admitted the Americans had solved the puzzle. No one battle erased every old assumption. Instead, the Lightning became more dangerous through accumulation, through doctrine, through familiarity, through the patient correction of earlier mistakes, through a growing American ability to use the aircraft on its own terms rather than on terms imposed by German fighter culture. In the early phases of American air operations over Europe, experience was expensive. Bomber crews suffered terribly. Escort coverage was inconsistent. Fighters were still part of a learning force trying to survive in an air war where the enemy had a long head start in operational reality. But the United States possessed something the Luftwaffe increasingly lacked: the capacity to absorb lessons on a vast scale. Aircraft did not simply arrive, procedures matured around them. Pilots did not just gain experience individually, units learned collectively. That distinction matters. A fighter becomes far more dangerous when its pilots stop trying to prove it can do everything and start using it ruthlessly for what it does best. That evolution changed the P-38 from an object of skepticism into a sharper instrument of escort war. American pilots learned to value altitude, energy, and timing. They learned that a slashing attack could be worth more than a prolonged engagement. They learned how to position themselves in relation to the bombers, how to read the routes German interceptors favored, how to commit and disengage with discipline rather than vanity. They learned to exploit the Lightning's firepower without demanding from it the sort of close, theatrical maneuver war that might flatter another aircraft more naturally. In other words, they learned not to argue with the machine. They learned to let it be what it was. And the Luftwaffe began to feel that change before many of its pilots fully admitted it. For German fighter units, the difference first appeared in texture. The enemy did not scatter the same way. Escorting Americans seemed less eager to be dragged away from the bomber stream. More attacks arrived with speed and intent. Formations that once looked clumsy or green now behaved with greater cohesion. That alone could be unsettling. Fighter combat depends heavily on rhythm. Pilots build mental habits around the way an enemy typically reacts. When that rhythm changes, even subtlety, it produces hesitation. Hesitation at combat speed is often all the opening an opponent needs. This is where the gap between reputation and reality becomes lethal. Some German pilots, especially sharp observers who survived long enough to compare encounters over time, may have sensed that the P-38 was becoming more troublesome than the jokes suggested. Others clung to the older narrative because it was easier, because it fit what they had already believed, or because wartime contempt can become a defense against the fear of change. Mockery has a useful function in military culture. It keeps danger manageable in the mind. But that function becomes deadly when the danger is increasing while the jokes remain the same. The smaller turning point, then, was not a headline event. It was a shift in competence. The Lightning did not become feared because it suddenly transformed into another aircraft. It became feared because its pilots, its formations, and the broader American escort system began to extract real value from its strengths. Once that happened, the Luftwaffe faced not a strange machine to be dismissed, but a machine integrated into a growing campaign of pressure. Imagine the repeated experience from the German side: scramble, climb, fuel check, scan the sky, close on the bomber stream, measure the risk, find a gap, commit. Then suddenly the escorts are there longer than before. They hit hard and do not behave like prey. They attack, break, and reappear. The bombers are still the main target, but now access to them is more costly. Every intercept becomes a calculation not just of tactics, but of exhaustion. Veteran pilots survive, but each survival grows more expensive. Newer men watch leaders vanish. Confidence starts to wear thin, not in a dramatic collapse, but in tiny internal adjustments. A little less certainty before takeoff. A little more silence after landing. The Americans, for their part, were not enjoying a clean ascent to mastery. Their learning process was soaked in loss. Men froze at altitude. Aircraft malfunctioned. Pilots misjudged dives or found themselves deep over enemy territory with little margin. Escort duty itself could be a grinding form of fear: long flight times, heavy weather, the knowledge that contact with the enemy might come without warning, and that mechanical failure far from home could mean death or capture. But because those sacrifices were folded into an enormous war machine that kept learning, the result was cumulative. Pain became procedure. Procedure became advantage. That is what the Luftwaffe was slow to fully grasp. It was not merely that the P-38 could kill, many aircraft could kill. It was that the Lightning, operating inside a maturing American system, was becoming strategically useful in a way that Mockery did not account for. This is why turning points of this kind are so important. They expose the difference between tactical prejudice and strategic reality. German pilots might still prefer their own machines. In certain forms of combat, they might still have good reason. But preference is not victory. Style is not victory. Even superiority in individual skill stops being enough when the structure around the battle changes. By the time enough German pilots understood that, the war in the air had already moved. The P-38 had helped escort bombers deeper. It had imposed risk in more places. It had contributed to a new psychological environment in which the Luftwaffe could no longer count on shaping every engagement by old instincts alone. And somewhere within that broad shift, there were individual moments when belief collided with reality in the most personal way possible. One mission, one unit, one combat. One veteran pilot trusting the old assumptions one time too many. That is where the story sharpens next, because large truths in war are often best understood through one sky and one deadly lesson. History grows clearer when it narrows. It is one thing to speak of doctrine, attrition, escort range, and strategic pressure. It is another to enter a single combat and feel the entire war compressed into seconds. In the sky, that compression is merciless. Years of experience, training, confidence, myth, and misjudgment can end in a burst of gunfire shorter than a sentence. So picture a mission over occupied Europe in the heavy season of the air war, when the American bomber offensive is no longer an experiment but a daily hammer blow. The bombers are outbound, droning in formation, engines steady, contrails streaking a pale sky. The escorts range with them, and among those escorts are P-38s long-legged, twin-boomed, cold at altitude, their pilots already fatigued by the sheer concentration required just to stay sharp in that frozen air. Inside one of those American cockpits sits a pilot who knows the Lightning's reputation from both sides. He has heard the complaints, perhaps spoken some of them himself. He knows the aircraft can punish carelessness. He knows dives can become traps if mishandled. He knows the cold can creep through gloves and boots until control inputs feel slightly distant, as though body and machine are negotiating through ice. But he also knows what the P-38 can do when the fight comes on the right terms. He trusts the nose guns. He trusts the engines. He trusts the speed he can build. Most of all, he knows his job. Stay with the bombers. Protect the formation. Do not chase ego. Do not throw away the mission for a private duel in the clouds. Now picture the German side. A veteran pilot, perhaps flying a Bf-109 or an FW-190, climbs toward the American stream with the reflexes of a man who has survived too much to still believe in luck. He has seen every kind of sky war. He has seen men panic, burn, vanish, break formation, make the wrong turn, overcommit, freeze. He has developed something close to contempt for pilots who have not lived through what he has lived through. The Americans? Brave, yes. Numerous, certainly, but often predictable. Heavy-handed, not subtle enough. And the twin-boomed fighter among them? Strange, dangerous only if mishandled by his own side. That is the kind of confidence wartime experience can produce. Not reckless, but settled, deep, efficient, deadly. He spots the formation. He measures the route in an instant. Perhaps the plan is to strike the bombers, break away, and climb again before the escorts can lock in. Perhaps he sees a P-38 and decides, almost unconsciously, that it is not the immediate priority. Or perhaps he believes he can cut through it quickly. Whatever the exact choice, the old judgment is still alive in him. Then the geometry changes. The American pilot sees the intercept develop and does not rush. He holds altitude a moment longer. The Lightning is not there to perform for him. It is there to hit. The German fighter commits, expecting time to maneuver out, but closure rates at high altitude can turn intention into disaster. The P-38 drops into the attack, nose steady, both engines pulling, the whole airframe seeming to surge forward with grim purpose. There is no wide spread of gunfire, no uncertain stitching across the sky. The burst comes concentrated and direct. In combat accounts across the war, what survives are fragments, flashes, angles, sudden damage, confused impressions, the shock of how quickly an engagement ceased to follow expectation. The German pilot, perhaps an ace, perhaps merely a veteran whose confidence had become nearly as dangerous as ace status, now finds himself under fire from the aircraft he did not fully respect. A hit lands. Then another. The canopy crazes or shatters. An engine coughs. Fuel or coolant spills into the slipstream. The aircraft shudders. The sky that, seconds before, seemed readable now becomes violent and unfamiliar. This is how reputations die, not in argument, in evidence. Maybe the German pilot survives, dragging a damaged aircraft home, landing pale and shaken, forced to explain why the fight unraveled. Maybe he does not survive at all, and the story lives only in the reactions of the men who watch the empty space where he should have returned. Either way, the effect spreads. The P-38 is no longer just a strange silhouette or a subject of barracks-level dismissal. It has become personal. It has killed someone respected. It has disrupted a story the unit told itself about what kinds of American fighters mattered and which ones could be brushed aside. Meanwhile, the American pilot does not enjoy a clean moment of triumph. Air combat rarely grants that. There is no pause button in the sky, no swelling soundtrack of victory. He must reform, scan, check instruments, look for wingmen, look for more attackers, judge fuel, stay with the bombers. Perhaps he barely has time to process what happened. Perhaps he only knows that a German fighter made the wrong choice and paid for it. Perhaps only later, on the ground, amid debriefings, coffee, cigarettes, and the strange quiet that follows combat, does the significance settle in. The lightning did exactly what it was supposed to do. Not beautifully, not theatrically, efficiently. This is the deadly lesson embedded in the title. German pilots mocked the P-38 because, from the outside, it seemed to violate the aesthetics of fighter excellence. But the sky does not care about aesthetics. It cares about position, speed, discipline, firepower, surprise, and whether your assumptions still match reality. In a single combat, all of that can be settled before either pilot has time to narrate it to himself. There is also a deeper tragedy here. These men were not caricatures. The German pilot was not stupid for trusting the instincts that had carried him through previous battles. The American pilot was not superhuman for surviving inside a difficult aircraft over enemy territory. What makes the story gripping is precisely that both men were serious professionals trapped in a war that kept changing faster than belief could comfortably follow. One had inherited confidence from an earlier phase of the conflict. The other belonged to a force learning, often painfully, how to turn material strength into combat advantage. When those trajectories crossed in one patch of European sky, the result could be final. And it was never just one fight. That is the point we must widen toward next. Because if one engagement could shatter individual confidence, repeated encounters of that kind could begin doing something larger. They could turn mockery into respect, and respect into a strategic problem the Luftwaffe could no longer afford. War in the air is not decided by symbolism alone. It is decided by exhaustion, by replacement rates, by fuel, by maintenance, by whether the same pilots can keep climbing into the same deadly sky week after week while the enemy grows harder to stop. This is where the story of the P-38 moves beyond individual combat and into the larger collapse of German air advantage. The Lightning did not single-handedly defeat the Luftwaffe, but it became one of the aircraft through which German contempt was transformed into something far more corrosive, recurring, expensive respect. To see why, you have to look at the broader structure of the air war. The American strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Europe demanded more than courage from bomber crews. It demanded escort. Without fighter cover reaching deep into hostile territory, bombers faced a terrible arithmetic. German interceptors could mass, attack repeatedly, and exploit vulnerability far from Allied bases. Every mile farther east, or deeper into the Reich, increased the pressure. Therefore, long-range fighters were not supplementary. They were part of the logic of the campaign itself. That is where the P-38 mattered. Its range extended the American fist. Its presence complicated German interceptions. It helped create a new aerial environment in which Luftwaffe fighters could no longer assume they would find exposed bombers at predictable moments with limited escort interference. Even when the Lightning was not the sole or perfect answer, it was a real answer, and real answers accumulate. They alter routes, tactics, morale, and loss rates. They do not need to be glamorous to be decisive. From the German perspective, this meant that every climb to meet the bomber stream was becoming heavier with consequence. The Luftwaffe still had dangerous pilots, it still had excellent aircraft, but now it faced an enemy capable of sustaining pressure with growing competence. American escorts, including P-38s, made interception more costly. To attack the bombers often meant passing through or enduring aggressive fighter cover. A veteran German pilot might still succeed. He might still bring down bombers, but what did it cost? Fuel, damage, fatigue. The lives of wingmen, the erosion of confidence among younger pilots who watched leaders disappear into smoke. And that erosion mattered more with each passing month because Germany could not replace experience easily. An ace lost was not merely one airplane shot down. He was training embodied, judgment embodied, survival knowledge embodied. He was, in some cases, a source of morale for an entire unit. When aircraft like the P-38 contributed to the death, wounding, or wearing down of such men, the effect reached beyond the individual. It thinned the Luftwaffe's future. This is where mockery curdled into strategic damage. Once German pilots began encountering the Lightning not as a joke, but as one more serious threat inside a widening Allied escort umbrella, the entire emotional weather of the air war shifted. Reports changed tone. Conversations changed tone. Pilots who once might have spoken dismissively now had to account for the aircraft's firepower, range, and the discipline of the units flying it. Respect did appear. But war is full of recognitions that arrive too late to save the side making them. There is an image worth holding here. A German fighter airfield late in the day. Mechanics moving with tired precision. Empty revetments where aircraft have not returned. A Staffelkapitän reading numbers that are no longer abstract sorties flown, losses taken, replacements arriving with too little experience. In the distance, more bombers will come tomorrow, and with them, more escorts, perhaps P-38s, perhaps other fighters as well. The point is no longer which American aircraft is most elegant or most admired. The point is that Germany is being forced to defend itself against a system that keeps improving while demanding more and more from men it cannot easily replace. The P-38 belonged to that system. It helped transform American industrial weight into tactical pressure, and tactical pressure, when applied relentlessly, becomes strategic suffocation. This is one of the hardest truths for elite fighting forces to accept. A skilled pilot can still win many engagements. A superior aircraft in certain conditions can still dominate a local fight. But if the enemy has built a structure in which losses are replaced, lessons are spread, escorts extend farther, bombers keep coming, and the psychological strain grows cumulative, then battlefield excellence begins to drown inside strategic imbalance. German pilots felt that imbalance in the sky long before every commander could fully correct for it on paper. Every escort mission that went deeper, every interception that cost too much, every ace forced to fight, not a single duel, but a layered battle against bombers, escorts, weather, fatigue, and scarcity. The Lightning became part of that tightening vice. And yet, from the American side, none of this felt easy or inevitable. Lightning pilots were not floating through a clean upward arc of dominance. They endured cold that bit through clothing and made the cockpit feel like a metal coffin hung in the air. They flew long missions over enemy land knowing a damaged aircraft might not make it back. They watched bombers burn even when escort did its job as well as possible. They understood that every improvement had been purchased with dead airmen and bitter adaptation. That is what gives the story its weight. Strategic effect does not come from abstraction. It comes from men doing the same dangerous thing until, one day, the sum of those efforts begins to break the enemy's ability to resist. On the German side, the reactions became more serious as the war deepened. There was less room for easy contempt, less patience for shallow readings of Allied aircraft. Reality in combat is persuasive. A machine that was once called strange or inferior becomes something to be respected the moment it starts altering the outcome of missions. But respect alone does not repair strategic decline. By the time many Luftwaffe units were forced into that respect, they were already defending under worsening circumstances, strained fuel supplies, increasing Allied reach, growing pressure on industry, and a pilot corps losing the luxury of error. This is why the P-38's significance lies not only in specific kills or famous encounters, but in the atmosphere it helped create. It contributed to a world in which German fighter pilots no longer entered battle with the same easy hierarchy of threats. It undermined complacency. It forced adjustment. It stole certainty. And in war, certainty is one of the most precious things a combat pilot has. The result was not merely tactical discomfort. It was a deeper injury to confidence within an already pressured force. What had begun as mockery was now part of a broader realization that the Americans were not only numerous, they were learning. Their machines, even the odd ones, were finding ways to matter. Their escort doctrine was hardening. Their reach was growing. The old assumptions were no longer safe. And once we understand that, we can finally slow down and ask the larger question beneath the machinery and the gunfire. What does this reversal really mean? What does it say about the war, about the men who fought it, and about the deadly relationship between pride and delayed understanding? At a certain point, every war story stops being mainly about hardware. The aircraft still matter. The engines, the guns, the wings, the fuel tanks, the design flaws, the performance envelope, all of it matters. But if you stay with the story long enough, you begin to see something else moving underneath the metal. Belief, habit, identity, pride, fear. The things men carry into combat before the first shot is fired. The story of German pilots mocking the P-38 and then learning, often brutally, that it could kill elite men over Europe is not just a story about one aircraft. It is a story about how arrogance dies in the air. That word arrogance deserves care. It should not be used lazily. Many Luftwaffe pilots were not braggarts in the shallow sense. They were professionals, shaped by a combat culture that had rewarded aggression, technical mastery, and faith in their own edge. Much of that confidence had once been justified. They had earned it through survival in a merciless theater. But success in war produces its own trap. It can harden judgment into doctrine. It can turn instinct into prejudice. It can make a man believe that because he once understood the sky, he still understands it even after the war beneath him has changed. That is what makes this story haunting. The Germans did not merely misread a machine. They misread the direction of the war. They still saw American air power, in part, through an old hierarchy: quantity versus quality, industrial force versus fighting skill, size versus elegance. And to some extent, those contrasts were real. The United States did rely on immense industrial output. It did field many young airmen who had far less experience than hardened German veterans. It did produce aircraft that sometimes looked less refined to the eyes of men raised on a different design culture. But war does not award victory based on aesthetic preference. It awards it to those who adapt, endure, and align their strengths with the demands of the moment. The Lightning, imperfect as it was, became one of the instruments through which that American adaptation was made visible. There is a sadness in that, because the men discovering this truth were often discovering it too late and at terrible cost. A German ace shot down by a P-38 was not just a symbol of reversal. He was a man with a past, with habits of speech, with friends on the ground, with letters perhaps tucked somewhere in his quarters, with a reputation inside his unit that made others feel safer when he took off beside them. His death or defeat did not simply alter a statistic, it altered morale. It altered the emotional architecture of the squadron. The empty bunk, the silence in debriefing, the strange care with which surviving pilots avoided saying too much. This is the human cost hidden inside tactical correction. But the American side had its own burden, and to tell the story honestly, we have to stay with that too. The men flying P-38s over Europe were not characters in a neat triumphal narrative. They were often exhausted, cold, frightened, and painfully aware that a mechanical failure or a wrong decision over enemy territory could end not in heroic closure, but in fire, capture, or disappearance. Escort duty was a form of stress that worked on the nerves in slow, relentless ways. The missions were long. The weather could be cruel. The enemy was real, skilled, and sometimes waiting exactly where he should not have been. Even success carried weight. A pilot might bring down an enemy fighter and then continue escorting bombers past flak bursts and smoke columns, knowing the day was far from over. Victory in the air was rarely clean enough to feel joyful for long. That is why the emotional center of this story is not pride of machine, but the cost of learning. The Americans learned how to use the P-38 more effectively through loss. The Germans learned that dismissing it was dangerous through loss. Both sides were corrected by reality, but only one side could absorb the correction more sustainably as the war progressed. This difference is crucial. The United States could turn painful lessons into wider procedural change and keep sending aircraft and pilots into the fight. Germany, increasingly, could not bear equivalent losses without degrading the very quality on which its fighter culture depended. So when we watch arrogance die in the air, what we are really watching is an imbalance in adaptability. One side is still trying to preserve an older image of superiority. The other is building a new form of superiority out of repetition, production, doctrine, and persistence. If you were to stand after the war in one of those now silent airfields, whether in Germany or England, and imagine the men who had once filled them, the tragedy becomes clearer. So many of them were young. So many trusted things that had once kept them alive. So many did not have time to fully understand the war that was killing them before it changed again. A veteran German pilot might have believed he was facing another heavy-handed American compromise, and discovered instead that he was confronting a machine woven into a much larger, colder logic of power. An American P-38 pilot might have believed he was simply surviving one more escort mission, while in fact helping to grind down one of the finest fighter arms of the age. This is why the story belongs on a channel like Warfront Archive. It is about the distance between battlefield belief and battlefield truth. It is about how dangerous it becomes when success teaches the wrong lesson. It is about how war strips away style and reveals function. And it is about the grim fact that reality rarely arrives gently. It arrives with noise, violence, and names added to casualty lists. By the end of the war, the old laughter about the P-38 could not survive intact. Too many men had seen otherwise. Too many units had paid otherwise. Too much evidence had accumulated in damaged aircraft, in dead aces, in disrupted interceptions, in escort missions that reached farther and pressed harder than before. So what remained of the belief that the P-38 was something to laugh at? Only the memory of how confidently men can be wrong before the sky corrects them. And that brings us to the ending this story has been moving toward, from the first burst of gunfire, the final return to what they believed, and what really happened. In the end, the sky keeps the final record. Not the jokes told on the ground, not the first impressions made by an unfamiliar silhouette, not the comforting beliefs of proud men who had learned to trust their own judgment perhaps a little too completely. The sky records outcomes. It records which aircraft arrived, which ones endured, which pilots came home, and which old assumptions were burned out of the war by force. German pilots mocked the P-38 because, to their eyes, it seemed to violate the grammar of fighter excellence. It was too big, too strange, too mechanically American, too flawed to be feared in the way a cleaner, more familiar machine demanded fear. In that belief, there was some truth. The Lightning was not perfect. It had real shortcomings. Europe exposed them harshly. Some of its pilots paid dearly for them. But what the mockery missed was the harsher truth waiting behind appearance. What really happened was that the P-38 proved dangerous enough, persistent enough, and strategically valuable enough to kill experienced German pilots, protect American bombers, and help erode the Luftwaffe's confidence at a moment when Germany could least afford such erosion. It did not need to be the most elegant fighter in the war. It did not need to win every type of engagement. It only needed to matter where the war demanded it matter. And it did. That is the reversal at the heart of this story. The Luftwaffe looked at the Lightning and saw an awkward compromise. The battlefield revealed a long-range escort fighter with heavy nose-mounted firepower, resilience, and growing tactical usefulness inside a rapidly maturing American air campaign. German fighter culture valued grace, instinct, and proven form. American war-making, increasingly, valued reach, procedure, adaptation, and sustained pressure. In the violent space where those philosophies met, contempt was gradually stripped away and replaced by a recognition no pilot ever wants to learn late that the enemy you dismissed is already capable of killing you. There is a final image worth leaving with: a European sky after combat. The violence has passed, but the silence is not peaceful. Contrails thin and fade. A damaged bomber limps west. Somewhere below, a field burns faintly where an aircraft came down. At a German base, mechanics stand beside a revetment waiting for an engine note that never arrives. At an American airfield in England, ground crews step toward returning P-38 Cetus, counting them as they land, stopping for one heartbeat each time a familiar plane does not appear. No one in either place is thinking about design theory now. No one is talking lightly about silhouettes or jokes. They are thinking about the missing. That is where all serious war stories end if they are honest enough. Not in triumph alone, not in bitterness alone, but in the human space left behind by collision between belief and reality. For the men who flew against the P-38, the lesson came at combat speed. Some learned it and survived. Some did not survive long enough to pass it on. For the men who flew the Lightning, the lesson was different but just as heavy. An imperfect aircraft, in the hands of a force willing to learn and keep paying the price of learning, could become far deadlier than its critics imagined. That is why this story still matters. Because it reminds us that wars are not only decided by the weapons men admire, they are often decided by the weapons men misjudge, by the systems they do not fully see, by the enemies they think they have already understood. In World War II, that pattern appears again and again, on land, at sea, and in the air. Assumptions harden. Reality waits. Then history turns on the moment someone realizes too late that the battlefield was asking a different question all along. For the Luftwaffe, the P-38 became one of those questions. Not the only one, not always the decisive one in isolation, but a revealing one. A machine they thought they understood before they truly encountered what it could do within the larger American war effort. A fighter they mocked until it started killing aces over Europe and taking its place in the slow destruction of German confidence in the air. And if there is a final truth beneath all of this, it may be this: the deadliest wartime mistakes often begin as laughter. That is the Warfront Archive lens, what they believed, what really happened. And if this story stays with you, the next question is impossible to resist. Which other weapon, aircraft, or battlefield force in World War II was dangerously underestimated until combat stripped away the myth and revealed the truth?